The best place to hide a dead man is in a crowd, but the best place to hide a living man, right under everyone's nose. When the infamous financier Victor Harrow vanished without a trace, the world assumed the worst: murder, abduction, or a desperate escape. But as Detective Graves studied the case, a chilling realization took root in his mind. The man they were hunting wasn't running. He was watching, hidden, playing a game so bold, so meticulously crafted, that the truth would only reveal itself when it was far too late. Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for an enthralling tale of mystery and intrigue, brought to you exclusively by the Curious Case channel, narrated by Dr. Rami. This gripping story will keep you on the edge of your seat, so don't forget to subscribe. The vanishing of Elias Blackwood was first whispered about in hushed tones among London's elite, a case so perplexing that even the most seasoned detectives found themselves at a loss. Blackwood, a wealthy collector of rare antiquities, vanished without a trace from his estate on a stormy night in 1925. What makes this case extraordinary is not just his sudden disappearance, but the eerie circumstances surrounding it. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a single flickering candle left on his writing desk and a cryptic note reading, "The past never forgets." It was a case that defied logic, baffling authorities, and thrilling conspiracy theorists for decades. Enter Inspector Alden Graves, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and unshakable resolve. Unlike his colleagues, Graves believed that the key to solving a mystery lay not in physical evidence, but in understanding the psychology of those involved. As he sat in his dimly lit study, the sound of rain tapping against the window, he pondered the strange intricacies of the case. He did not need to see the crime scene to uncover the truth. His mind was his greatest weapon. With each passing hour, he pieced together a puzzle no one else could comprehend, realizing that this was no ordinary disappearance. It was a carefully orchestrated illusion, a game of deception played by a mind as brilliant as his own. But Graves was not one to be outwitted. As he connected the final pieces, the true horror of Elias Blackwood's fate revealed itself, one that involved betrayal, obsession, and a secret buried deep beneath the foundations of Blackwood Manor. In the end, the greatest mysteries are not those that confound the eyes, but the ones that unravel the soul. Disappearance. My dear fellow, there's no such thing as true disappearance anymore, said Inspector Hargrave, leaning back in his chair, a confident smirk playing on his lips. One might try to erase themselves, but the world has grown too small, too connected. A face cannot vanish without leaving a shadow behind. Detective Julian Mercer arched an eyebrow, watching the inspector with quiet amusement. That is a rather bold claim, Inspector, he said, adjusting the precise alignment of his teacup, an unconscious habit he had developed over years of meticulous observation. Yet history tells us that the most carefully orchestrated illusions are the ones people refuse to believe possible. A clever man, one with patience and a mind trained in strategy, could make himself dissolve like mist at dawn. Hargrave scoffed. Oh, come now, Mercer, a man can dye his hair, change his clothes, even alter his mannerisms, but he cannot unmake himself. Newspapers print his face, telegraphs spread his name, and within days the entire country is watching. There's no room for ghosts in an age of ink and wire. Mercer allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Ah, but you assume he plays by the rules of the ordinary fugitive, the desperate thief, the absconding criminal, the man running in fear. But what if he is not running? What if instead, he has planned every detail to perfection? What if his disappearance is not an escape, but a masterpiece of deception? Hargrave's smirk faltered just slightly. You believe a man could vanish by sheer intellect alone? Not believe, Inspector. I know it to be true. Mercer's eyes gleamed as he lifted his cup, taking a measured sip. After all, aren't the best tricks the ones performed in plain sight? So my dear friend, Mercer said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, a fox may be clever, but does that mean we should ask it to solve the riddle of a missing man? Inspector Hargrave scoffed. Come now, Mercer, you're not going to dismiss the importance of physical evidence, are you? The smallest detail, an overlooked footprint, a misplaced object, can crack a case wide open. Mercer smiled, adjusting the delicate porcelain cup in front of him with meticulous precision. "Oh, I do not deny the value of details. Quite the contrary. The danger lies in giving them too much importance. Most details are nothing but distractions, background noise meant to lead the inattentive astray. The true key lies elsewhere." He tapped his temple. "Here, the mind. The senses can be deceived, but the mind, if trained correctly, sees beyond deception." Hargrave raised an eyebrow, his amusement evident. "You mean to tell me that you could solve a case without ever stepping foot outside this very room?" "That is precisely what I am saying," Mercer replied smoothly. "Give me the facts, only the facts, and I will unravel the mystery, without so much as glancing at the crime scene." Hargrave let out a hearty laugh, slapping his knee. "All right then, let's put that arrogance to the test. I'll wager £5 that you can't tell me where to find Elias Blackwood, dead or alive, before the week is out." Mercer considered for a moment, his eyes narrowing with keen interest. "Very well, I accept. After all, the English have such an amusing obsession with sport." He leaned forward. "Now, tell me everything." Hargrave straightened. "Blackwood was last seen on Friday evening. His routine, as always, was predictable. He returned from his London office by the 5:20 train, and arrived at his estate, Ashwood Manor, just after 6. He dined alone as his wife was away visiting family. The staff say he seemed perfectly normal, no sign of distress, no unusual behavior. After dinner, he took his usual walk around the grounds, speaking briefly with the groundskeeper about some repairs to the greenhouse. Then around 9 o'clock, he retreated to his study to write letters. That was the last time anyone saw him." Mercer nodded, steepling his fingers. "And was there any indication that he intended to leave the house again?" "None," Hargrave said firmly. "His coat and hat were still in the hallway. The front door was locked from the inside, the windows secured, no sign of forced entry, and yet by morning, he was gone. No carriage tracks, no footprints beyond those of the staff. It's as if he simply vanished." Mercer's lips curled into a small knowing smile. "Vanished, you say? No, Inspector, a man does not vanish. A man like Blackwood, calculating, meticulous, he does not simply disappear. He orchestrates his own disappearance." Hargrave frowned. "What are you implying?" Mercer leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "That this is no ordinary missing person case, Inspector. This is something much more deliberate, and I suspect that before the week is out, you will find that Elias Blackwood never intended to be found at all." "So Mercer," Hargrave continued, his voice carrying the weight of intrigue, "Blackwood left the study, walked down the hallway, stepped out the front door, and was never seen again. From that moment on, he ceased to exist." Mercer, seated comfortably, turned the delicate handle of his teacup with the precision of a man who valued order in all things. "Ah," he murmured, his sharp eyes gleaming, "a perfect disappearance. Continue, my good friend." Hargrave shifted in his seat. Roughly 15 minutes later, the butler answered the door to a man, tall, dark, with a neatly trimmed mustache. He introduced himself as Samuel Lowen, and stated that he had an appointment with Mr. Blackwood. As per the master's instructions, he was shown into the study and asked to wait. Mercer nodded, listening intently. An hour passed, no sign of Blackwood. Finally Lowen, appearing slightly irritated, rang for the butler, and expressed his regret. He had waited long enough, and had a train to catch. Mrs. Blackwood, puzzled by her husband's unexplained absence, extended her apologies, but Lowen merely nodded, his expression unreadable, and took his leave. Mercer set down his cup, and that was the last official sighting of either man. Hargrave exhaled. Correct. By Sunday morning, with no sign of Blackwood, the authorities were called in. We scoured every lead. No one at the village post office had seen him. No station clerk reported him boarding a train. His automobile never left the garage. No carriages were hired. If he had arranged for some private transport, the promise of a substantial reward would have certainly brought forth a driver willing to disclose his involvement. And yet, nothing. Mercer's gaze did not waver. No trace at all, not a whisper, Hargrave admitted. There was a minor race meet at Eldenfield, about 5 miles away. The possibility exists that he could have walked there and blended into the crowd, unnoticed. But there is no evidence, no footprints on the damp road, no sightings from anyone. Mercer leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "No, Inspector, a man does not simply vanish. He either chooses to disappear, or is made to." Hargrave frowned. "So what are you suggesting?" Mercer smiled faintly, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished table. "I am suggesting, dear friend, that Elias Blackwood is far closer than you think, and that the key to this puzzle does not lie in where he went, but in why he left. Since then, his photograph and a full description have been published in every major newspaper, yet not a single credible lead has emerged. No railway clerk, no hotel concierge, no villager has come forward with a sighting. It is as if Elias Blackwood never existed." Hargrave's voice was tight with frustration as he set his glass down. Across from him, Mercer listened, silent and unreadable, his keen eyes fixed on the inspector. "We've had dozens of letters, countless supposed sightings, each one leading to nothing. Every promising trail has collapsed into thin air, and then on Monday morning, the case took a darker turn." Hargrave paused. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, deliberate. "Blackwood's study contains a hidden safe, concealed behind a thick velvet portiere. When we finally examined it, we found it had been forced open, cleanly, professionally. It was completely emptied." Mercer lifted an eyebrow. "A robbery then?" "The peculiar thing is," Hargrave continued, "there were no signs of a break-in. The windows were locked from the inside, the doors remained bolted, no footprints in the damp garden soil, no tampering with the locks. If it was a burglary, then the thief either had a key, or was already inside the house." Mercer tapped a finger against his chin. "The household would have been in chaos after Blackwood's disappearance. It's possible the safe was looted on Saturday, but no one noticed until Monday." "Precisely," Hargrave admitted, "which brings us to our prime suspect, Samuel Lowen. After all, he was the last known visitor." Mercer folded his hands, considering. "Has he been arrested?" "Not yet," Hargrave admitted, "but we're watching him closely." A silence stretched between them. Then Mercer spoke. "What was taken?" Hargrave sighed. "That's what we're trying to determine. His junior business partner and Mrs. Blackwood have provided some details, but there's one troubling fact." Mercer leaned in. "Which is?" "The safe contained valuable bonds, documents, things that could be converted into money, yet nothing of significant value appears to have been stolen." Mercer smiled faintly, a glint of intrigue in his eyes. "Then, my dear Hargrave, you're looking at the wrong question. The mystery is not who took something, but why something was left behind. There was a considerable sum in bearer bonds, Inspector," Hargrave continued, his fingers drumming lightly on the table, "and a very large amount in cash, notes, to be exact. The timing was unfortunate. Blackwood had just concluded a significant financial transaction, leaving an unusual volume of money in the safe." Mercer's expression darkened. "And the valuables?" Hargrave sighed, shaking his head. "A small fortune in jewelry as well, all belonging to Mrs. Blackwood. Her husband had developed quite the obsession with rare gems over the past few years. It had become his custom. Each month, without fail, he would gift her something exquisite. A sapphire necklace from India, emerald-studded brooches from Paris, diamonds of near impossible clarity. The man had an eye for perfection." Mercer leaned back slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving Hargrave. "A rather tempting haul for any thief." "Precisely," the inspector agreed. "Now let's talk about Lowen. Do we know the nature of his business with Blackwood that evening?" Hargrave exhaled through his nose. "The two weren't exactly on friendly terms. Lowen is a speculator, minor league, compared to Blackwood. Yet, on more than one occasion, he managed to outmaneuver the banker in the market. That alone made Blackwood wary of him." "Did they meet often?" "Seldom, if ever," Hargrave admitted. "But this time was different. The meeting was urgent. South American shares were involved." Mercer's interest sharpened. "South America? Did Blackwood have dealings there?" "He did. Spent the entire autumn in Buenos Aires, according to Mrs. Blackwood. She mentioned it in passing, though she didn't seem to know the specifics." Mercer studied the inspector for a long moment before speaking again. "What about his personal life? Any domestic troubles?" Hargrave shook his head. "By all accounts, his marriage was peaceful, perhaps uneventful. Mrs. Blackwood is pleasant, if somewhat unremarkable, a quiet woman, not particularly bright, and certainly not the type to be involved in anything sinister. Then we can rule out a domestic motive, Mercer mused. What about enemies? A man like Blackwood, wealthy, ruthless in business, he must have had rivals. Oh, plenty, Hargrave said dryly. Banking is a cutthroat world, and Blackwood was not known for his mercy. He outplayed and outlasted many. There are men, I'm sure, who would love nothing more than to see him fall, but would any of them resort to murder? Mercer's voice was quiet, calculated. That's the question, isn't it? Hargrave said. And if so, where's the body? Mercer's lips curled into a knowing smirk. That, Inspector, is the most intriguing part of all. The silence that followed was thick with tension. By the way, Mercer said, flipping through his notebook, one of the gardeners mentioned something odd. He swears he saw a figure moving toward the side of the house, near the rose garden. Inspector Hargrave raised an eyebrow. The study opens onto the rose garden, doesn't it? Mercer nodded. Exactly. Blackwood often used that entrance, but the gardener was too far away, tending to the cucumber frames, and he couldn't confirm if it was Blackwood or someone else. Worse, he can't pinpoint the exact time, only that it was before 6, since the gardeners clock out then. Hargrave leaned forward, and Blackwood left the house at approximately 5:30. What's beyond the rose garden? A lake. Hargrave's expression sharpened. A boathouse? Yes, with a couple of punts. The inspector tapped his fingers on the desk. Suicide, Mercer shrugged. If that's what you're thinking, you're not alone. Miller's heading down first thing tomorrow to have the lake dragged. Thorough sort of man. A faint smile touched Hargrave's lips. He turned his attention to the large newspaper sprawled across the desk. Mercer, pass me today's Chronicle. Mercer obliged, handing it over. Hargrave unfolded the paper and studied the grainy black and white photograph of the missing banker. His gaze lingered on the striking features. Wavy hair slightly longer than usual, thick mustache, pointed beard, heavy brows, dark eyes. Yes, Mercer confirmed. Hair and beard, turning grey. A touch, yes. Hargrave didn't respond immediately. He simply ran a finger over his chin, deep in thought. Mercer leaned in, curious. Well, what do you make of it? It's all fairly straightforward, isn't it? On the contrary, Hargrave said quietly, it's anything but. Mercer's expression flickered between confusion and amusement. Now that's interesting. So the more complicated it seems, the easier it is for you. Hargrave's lips curled slightly. Not quite. I only trust a case when it's complicated. If something looks too clear, too simple, he tapped the newspaper gently, then someone has made it so. Mercer sighed. You've got a full week to figure it out, Inspector. Hargrave leaned back, shutting his eyes. Plenty of time, he murmured. All I need to do now is think, and you'll bring me any fresh developments that arise, particularly the findings of the ever-diligent razor-sharp Inspector Mercer. Smirk. Of course, that's the deal. As I walked him to the door, he chuckled. Almost feels unfair, doesn't it? He gave me a knowing look. Like stealing candy from a kid. I couldn't help but smile at the jest. Even as I returned to the room, the smile lingered. ABN, Hargrave's voice cut through the air. You are amused, my friend. His keen eyes twinkled as he wagged a finger at me. You doubt old Hargrave, don't you? You think my little grey cells have finally run dry. I hesitated, but he simply chuckled. Ah, do not be embarrassed. Come, let us piece together this puzzle, unfinished. Yes, but already yielding a few fascinating clues. The lake? I said, letting the word hang in the air. Indeed. Hargrave steepled his fingers. And even more than the lake, the boathouse. I cast him a sideways glance, expecting him to elaborate, but he merely smiled, his most unreadable, secretive smile. He knew something, I could feel it, but he wasn't ready to share it just yet. We heard nothing from Mercer until the following evening. He arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, his face flushed with the thrill of discovery. Well, my friend, Hargrave greeted him calmly. Things are progressing, I assume, but do not tell me you have fished Blackwood's body from your lake. I simply won't believe it. Mercer exhaled, shaking his head. No body, but he let the suspense build. We did find something. Hargrave raised an eyebrow. We found his clothes, Mercer said, his voice tinged with triumph. The exact clothes he was wearing when he left the house. I sat up straighter. Hargrave's expression didn't change. Curious, he murmured. Tell me, was anything else missing? Mercer shook his head. His valet swears by it. Every other item of his wardrobe is accounted for. I looked at Hargrave, expecting surprise, maybe even concern. Instead, I found that same knowing gleam in his eyes. He was already 3 steps ahead. There's more. Mercer leaned forward, his voice taut with excitement. We've arrested Lowen. Hargrave's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for Mercer to continue. One of the maids, she's in charge of locking up the bedroom windows, swears she saw Lowen crossing the rose garden towards the study around 6:15. That's just 10 minutes before he supposedly left the house. I inhaled sharply. And what does Lowen have to say about that? At first he outright denied ever stepping outside. Mercer's lips curled in satisfaction. But when we pressed him, reminded him the maid was certain, he suddenly remembered stepping through the window to inspect a rare species of rose. He scoffed. Not exactly convincing, is it? Hargrave tilted his head. A weak story indeed, and yet surely that alone isn't enough to arrest the man. Mercer's eyes gleamed. There's more. Hargrave leaned in ever so slightly. New evidence, Mercer continued. Mr. Blackwood always wore a heavy gold ring, solitaire diamond, little finger, right hand. Everyone knew it. That ring turned up in a London pawn shop. Saturday night. I stiffened. Mercer let the moment stretch before delivering the final blow. The man who pawned it. Billy Kellett, the thief? I asked. Mercer nodded. A known pickpocket. Did 3 months last fall for swiping a gentleman's watch, and get this, he didn't exactly slip away unnoticed. He tried to pawn the ring at 5 different places before he finally succeeded. Then the fool got drunk, picked a fight with a policeman, and got himself arrested. And now, sober as a judge, and scared stiff, we had a little chat with him at Bow Street. Let's just say we hinted he might be facing more than just theft. Hargrave tapped his fingers on the armrest. And what is his version of events? Mercer exhaled. A strange one, that's for sure. Says he was at the Enfield races on Saturday, probably more interested in lifting wallets than betting. But in any case, he had a rough day, lost everything. By evening, he was trudging along the road to Chingside, completely down on his luck. Just before reaching the village, he sat down in a ditch to rest. Mercer paused, as if weighing the significance of what he was about to say. That's when it happened. Hargrave's eyes flickered, intrigued. When what happened? Precisely. Mercer's grin was grim. That's the question, isn't it? A few minutes later, Kellett had noticed a man striding down the road towards the village. Dark-complexioned gent, sharp eyes, big mustache. One of them city toffs, was how he described him. Kellett, crouched behind a pile of stones, remained unseen. The man walked briskly, but just before passing him, he paused. He cast a quick glance up and down the road, as if ensuring no one was watching. Then, in a single swift motion, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, and flung it over the hedge. The action was deliberate, calculated. Without hesitation, he continued walking towards the station. Kellett, ever the opportunist, was intrigued. He had heard the faintest chink as the object struck the ground on the other side, a metallic sound. Valuable, perhaps. The moment the man was out of sight, Kellett scrambled to his feet and slipped through the hedge. A brief search in the overgrown grass revealed a gleaming gold ring, thick, heavy, and unmistakably expensive. That's his story, Mercer finished grimly. Of course Lowen denies everything. Hargrave leaned back, steepling his fingers. And Kellett, can his word be trusted? Mercer gave a dry chuckle. A career thief caught pawning stolen goods? Hardly. The jury won't put much stock in what he says. For all we know, he might have done more than just steal the ring. He could have met Blackwood on that road, robbed him, and, no, Hargrave interjected, shaking his head. It doesn't fit. Kellett is a small-time thief, not a murderer. And if he had killed Blackwood, where's the body? A man like him wouldn't have had the means to dispose of it so cleanly. Mercer hesitated, then conceded. True. And another thing, if Kellett had murdered him for that ring, he wouldn't have been so reckless about selling it. He tried 5 different pawn shops before finally offloading it. Not the actions of a man trying to cover his tracks. And Hargrave added, if he's been in custody since Saturday, how could he have given such an accurate description of Lowen? Mercer let out a long breath. Good points, all of them. But here's what doesn't sit right with me. Why did Lowen dispose of the ring in such a careless way? A man like him, intelligent, deliberate, wouldn't just toss away evidence like that. Hargrave's gaze sharpened. Unless he wanted it to be found. A silence hung between them, heavy with implication. Mercer broke it first. Well, there's another thing. His voice dropped slightly, as if revealing a secret he had only just pieced together. Just beyond the lake, past the boathouse, there's a small gate that leads up the hill. A 3-minute walk from there and you reach. He let the words linger. Hargrave's pulse quickened. A lime kiln. Mercer nodded slowly. Exactly. Good heavens, I exclaimed, my voice barely above a whisper. You mean that the lime, which would have utterly destroyed the body, would be powerless to affect the metal of the ring? Exactly, Mercer replied grimly, his gaze sharp with understanding. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The sheer audacity of such a crime, the meticulous planning, it was monstrous. That explains everything, I murmured, almost to myself. What a horrifying way to erase a man from existence, as if compelled by an unspoken force. Mercer and I both turned to Poirot. Throughout the conversation, he had been silent, his expression unreadable, his fingertips pressed together in that familiar pose of deep contemplation. But now his brow was furrowed, his gaze distant, as though reaching into the depths of his formidable intellect for some elusive truth. A thrill of anticipation ran through me. This was the moment. Surely Poirot had pieced it together at last. His silence, his intensity, it was the mark of a mind on the very precipice of revelation. I held my breath, waiting for his pronouncement. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, his posture relaxed. He turned, looked directly at Mercer, and asked, in the most conversational tone imaginable, "Tell me, my friend, do you happen to know whether Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood occupied the same bedroom?" I blinked. Mercer for once was caught completely off guard. He stared at Poirot in sheer disbelief, as if the question had been in an entirely foreign language. Then, after a beat of stunned silence, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Good Lord, Poirot, I thought you were about to say something profound." He shook his head, amusement flickering across his features. "As for your question, how on earth should I know?" Poirot remained unperturbed. "But you could find out," he pressed, his voice deceptively mild. Mercer chuckled again, but there was a trace of uncertainty beneath the humor now. "Of course, if you really want to know, merci mon ami, I should be obliged if you would make a point of it." Poirot's tone was almost absent-minded, as though the matter was of little importance, and yet there was something in his manner, something so deliberately casual, that it only heightened my suspicion that he was on to something crucial. Mercer studied him for a few moments longer, his detective's instinct telling him that there was more beneath the surface, but Poirot had already withdrawn into himself, seemingly lost in his thoughts once more. With a quiet sigh, Mercer turned to me, and muttered under his breath, "Poor fellow, the war must have rattled his nerves more than we thought," and with a slow shake of his head, he strode out of the room, leaving me alone with Poirot, whose mind, I was certain, was already racing far ahead of the rest of us. As Poirot remained deep in thought, his gaze fixed on some invisible thread of logic, I idly reached for a sheet of paper. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of the case pressing upon us. To occupy myself, I began scribbling notes, key details, suspicions, anything that stood out. It was a habit I had only recently picked up, one I secretly hoped might mirror Poirot's own deductive methods. My friend's voice suddenly cut through the quiet. He had emerged from his trance-like state, now brisk and alert. "Que faites-vous là, mon ami?" I looked up, startled. I was jotting down what occurred to me as the main points of interest in this affair. A glimmer of approval passed through his sharp eyes. "Ah, you become methodical, at last." I concealed my satisfaction and cleared my throat. "Shall I read them to you?" "By all means." Settling back, I recited my list with the confidence of a man who had finally grasped the essentials of the mystery. 1. All the evidence points to Lowen, having been the man who forced the safe. 2. He had a personal grudge against Blackwood. 3. He lied in his initial statement about never leaving the study. 4. If Billy Kellett's story is to be believed, Lowen is unmistakably implicated. I leaned back, awaiting my friend's approval. Surely I had captured the essence of the case, presented a flawless summary of the evidence thus far. Poirot, however, merely looked at me with that familiar expression of patient disappointment. He shook his head slowly, his manner that of a teacher addressing a particularly slow pupil. "Mon pauvre ami, you try, yes, but the important details, you never appreciate them, and your reasoning, it is, how do you say, upside down?" I stiffened. "How?" Poirot laced his fingers together, his voice gentle but firm. "Let us take your 4 points one by one. 1. Mr. Lowen could not possibly have known he would get the opportunity to open the safe. He came for a scheduled business interview, an appointment, nothing more. Could he have known, in advance, that Mr. Blackwood would step out to post a letter, that he would be left alone in the study?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Non, mon ami. Such a coincidence is too great." I hesitated, then offered, but he could have seized the opportunity as it came. Poirot pounced. "Ah, and the tools. Did he carry a set of burglar's instruments in his pocket, on the mere chance he would be left alone in a room with a locked safe?" His voice dropped to a "No, Hastings, a man cannot break into such a safe with a mere penknife." A sliver of doubt crept into my thoughts. Still I pressed on. "What about point 2? Lowen had a grudge against Blackwood." Poirot gave an exaggerated sigh. "Ah, the English and their grudges. You say grudge, but what you truly mean is rivalry." "Yes, Lowen had once or twice outmaneuvered Blackwood in business dealings, but does that make him a murderer?" "No, my friend. To destroy one's opponent in the financial world is common, but to kill, that is something different altogether." I opened my mouth, then closed it. Poirot was right, yet again. He continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You focus on the obvious, the convenient, the elements that fit together too neatly. But what if the truth is something else entirely, something unexpected, something no one has even considered yet?" His gaze darkened, his mind clearly spiraling into deeper, unseen layers of the case. The room fell into silence once more. Poirot's words left me unsettled, my carefully constructed theories crumbling like dry paper. Had I been blind to the real truth all along? Poirot's sharp eyes gleamed as he leaned forward, his fingers steepled in thought. His voice, calm yet edged with finality, carried the weight of certainty, and presumably those transactions were undertaken with the intent of benefiting himself. "Non." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But consider, mon ami, does one truly bear a grudge against a man they have outwitted? Is it not far more likely that resentment festers in the heart of the one who has been bested?" I frowned, considering his words. "Then you're suggesting that whatever resentment existed, if there was any at all, would have been on Blackwood's side?" Poirot nodded, satisfied that I was beginning to grasp his reasoning. "Well," I countered, "you can't deny that Lowen lied about never leaving the study. That alone is suspicious." Poirot did not immediately respond. He tapped his fingers against the polished wood of the table, his expression unreadable. "Oui, that is true," he conceded. "But fear does strange things to a man's mind. He may have panicked. Consider the circumstances. At the moment of his denial, the missing man's clothes had just been discovered in the lake." His voice lowered slightly, as if speaking more to himself than to me. "A foolish lie, yes, but not necessarily the lie of a murderer. He would have done far better to tell the truth." "And my 4th point?" I pressed. Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, now that is where things become truly interesting. If Kellett's story is true, then Lowen is undeniably implicated. That much cannot be disputed." I leaned back, somewhat triumphant. "So I did, after all, identify at least one vital fact." "Perhaps." Poirot said, a shadow of amusement flickering across his face. But you have entirely overlooked the two most important points, the very clues that unlocked the entire mystery. A thrill of anticipation ran through me. And what are those? Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper, his words deliberate and precise. 1. The undeniable passion Mr. Blackwood had developed over the past few years for acquiring fine jewelry. And 2. His seemingly innocuous trip to Buenos Aires last autumn. I stared at him, utterly perplexed. Poirot, you cannot be serious. He raised a hand, silencing my protest. I am most serious, mon ami. Sacred thunder. I only hope Jap does not forget my little commission. And as though summoned by Poirot's very words, a telegram arrived the following morning, precisely at 11 o'clock. Poirot, occupied with an arrangement of his perfectly aligned breakfast utensils, gestured for me to read it aloud. I unfolded the paper and scanned the message. Husband and wife have occupied separate rooms since last winter. Poirot shot upright in his chair, his eyes gleaming with unmistakable triumph. Aha, he cried. And now we are in mid-June. All is solved. I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep pace. Poirot, I don't understand. He smiled, the kind of smile that only emerges when one has seen a truth invisible to all others. Tell me, mon ami, you have no money invested in Blackwood and Company, do you? The question caught me off guard. No, I said slowly. Why? Because, he murmured with a finality that sent a chill down my spine, I would strongly advise you to withdraw it before it is too late. Jap's brows furrowed as he stared at Poirot, gripping the telegram so tightly that the paper crinkled audibly. His voice, edged with incredulity, sliced through the room. How the devil did you know, Poirot? How could you possibly have known? Poirot, ever composed, merely smiled, his fingers delicately tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Ah, mon ami, he said smoothly. After your wire, it was no longer a mystery, it was a certainty. He leaned back, his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. You see, from the very beginning, the burglary at the safe struck me as rather theatrical. Jap slammed the newspaper onto the table, the bold black headlines practically leaping off the page. Financier vanishes, Blackwood & Co. collapses in sensational failure. I exhaled sharply, my mind racing. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. The prestigious banking firm, once a symbol of unshakable success, had crumbled overnight, and Blackwood, the man at the heart of it all, had disappeared without a trace. Jap ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. Blast it, Poirot, we thought we were looking at a simple case of theft, or maybe even murder, but this is something else entirely. How did you see it coming? Poirot shrugged, adjusting his cuffs with precision. Come now, mon cher Jap, consider the details as I did. A wealthy man, known for his obsession with acquiring rare jewelry, suddenly vanishes on the very eve of his financial empire's collapse. His supposed burglary was just a smokescreen, a distraction designed to mislead. And then, of course, there was the rather curious matter of his separate bedroom. Jap stopped mid-stride, blinking. His bedroom? What the devil does that have to do with anything? Poirot allowed himself a small knowing smile. Everything, my dear Jap, everything. Before Jap could press further, the butler appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. Excuse me, sirs, but there's a gentleman at the door. Says he has urgent business concerning Mr. Blackwood. Poirot's expression darkened ever so slightly. Ah, he murmured, rising from his chair with the air of a man who had been expecting this very moment. The game, I believe, is truly afoot. Jewels, cash, bearer bonds, everything vanishing as if by magic, yet arranged with meticulous precision. But for whom? Who was meant to reap the rewards of such a grand deception? Poirot's voice was calm, yet beneath it lay the weight of a revelation. Mon cher Jap, the answer is clear. Who else but Monsieur Blackwood himself? A man who, as you English say, looks after number one above all else. Jap muttered a curse under his breath, scanning the newspaper headlines again. You mean to say, he growled, that this whole thing was an act, a vanishing trick pulled off by the man himself? Poirot nodded. Indeed, the signs were all there, my friend. His sudden obsession with collecting jewels, an interest that seemed harmless, eccentric even, yet was in reality the foundation of his great escape. The funds he siphoned off, he did not spend recklessly. No, he converted them into jewels, small, easily hidden, impossible to trace. And then, with a cunning worthy of the finest illusionist, he replaced the originals with paste duplicates, ensuring that even the keenest eye would not suspect the theft. I felt a chill run down my spine. The audacity of it, the sheer brilliance of such a deception. Poirot continued, his voice measured, unwavering. With his fortune secured under an assumed name in some remote, unsuspected corner of the world, he set the final stage of his performance. He arranges a meeting with Mr. Whitmore, a man foolish enough to have challenged him in business, a perfect scapegoat. Then he takes a drill, leaves a deliberate mark on the safe, to give the illusion of forced entry, and with everything set in place, he steps out of his house, and then, he disappears. Japp exhaled sharply. Disappears. To where Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, that is the question, is it not? He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. A man like Blackwood does not simply vanish. He has a plan, a carefully calculated route to freedom, a new identity, a new life. The question we must ask is, did he truly succeed? Or is he closer than we think? At that moment, the butler reappeared, his face pale. Sears, there's been a development. Japp turned swiftly. What is it? The butler hesitated. A body has been found. A silence thick as fog settled over the room. Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a glimmer of intrigue, perhaps even satisfaction. Ah, he murmured, at last the final piece of the puzzle. Poirot paused, stretching out his hand for another boiled egg. He examined it critically, his delicate fingers rotating it as if it were a precious artifact. A deep frown settled on his brow. This is truly insupportable, he muttered. Every hen seems to have its own artistic interpretation of what an egg should be. What symmetry can exist on the breakfast table, when eggs arrive in all shapes and sizes? The shops should at least have the decency to sort them properly, perhaps by weight, or better still by color. Ah, order, mon ami. Even in the smallest details, one must have order. Japp, who had been gripping the morning newspaper so tightly it had begun to crumple, let out an exasperated groan. To hell with the eggs, Poirot, let the hens lay them square for all I care. Just tell us, where in God's name did our man go when he left the Cedars? That is, if you actually know. Poirot sighed, placing his spoon down with exaggerated precision. He wiped his fingers delicately on his napkin before looking up, his green eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. Eh bien, my dear Japp, he went exactly where a man of his cunning would go, his hiding place. Ah, this Monsieur Blackwood, there may be some imperfection in his moral character, some slight malformation in his grey cells, but I assure you, those grey cells are of the highest quality. Japp's patience was wearing thin. He leaned forward, his knuckles rapping against the wooden table. So you do know where he is hiding? Poirot nodded, a small satisfied smile playing at his lips. May we, and it is most ingenious. For the Lord's sake, tell us then. Japp thundered, half rising from his chair. Poirot, unbothered by his companion's impatience, returned to his egg with methodical precision. Carefully, he collected every fragment of shell from his plate, arranging them neatly in the egg cup. Then, with the delicate touch of an artist finishing a masterpiece, he placed the emptied shell back on top, forming a perfect hollow replica of the original egg. He studied it for a moment, then tapped it lightly with his spoon. Japp stared, his face turning red. Poirot, I swear to Poirot raised a finger, silencing him. His voice when he spoke was light but firm. You see, mon ami, sometimes, what appears to be whole is merely an illusion, and the greatest trick of all, to hide in plain sight. A hush fell over the room. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Japp swallowed hard. You mean, he whispered. Poirot simply smiled. Poirot completed his curious little operation with the eggshells, arranging them with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. He studied his handiwork for a moment, a small smile playing at his lips, before looking up and beaming at us both, as though we were particularly bright pupils in a classroom. Now, mes amis, he said, lacing his fingers together, you are both men of intelligence. Let us use that intelligence. Consider the question I posed to myself. If I were this man, where should I hide? His gaze turned to me first. Hastings, mon ami, what do you say? I hesitated, considering. Well, I said slowly, if it were me, I don't think I'd run at all. Disappearing completely would only draw attention. No, I'd stay in London, right in the thick of it. There's safety in a crowd. I'd take the tubes, the buses, move about the city as if nothing had happened. People don't notice strangers in the everyday rush of things. 10 to 1, I'd never be recognized. Poirot nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. Instead he turned to Japp, his expression unreadable. Japp, ever the man of action, scoffed. I don't agree. A clean getaway, that's the only sensible option. If I were planning this, I'd have had everything arranged well in advance. A false identity, an escape route, a yacht waiting with steam up. The moment the alarm was raised, I'd be halfway across the world, sipping something cold on the deck of a boat, heading for some forgotten island where no one would ever think to look. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. His eyes, sharp and knowing, flickered between us, then slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. Ah, mes amis, he murmured, his voice rich with amusement. How little you understand the mind of a true mastermind. We exchanged glances. What do you mean? I asked. Poirot leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret that the very walls should not overhear. You both think in ordinary terms, either vanish into the masses like a whisper in the wind, or flee to the farthest corners of the earth where no one can follow. But a man like our Monsieur Blackwood, who has spent a lifetime weaving deception, does not take such an obvious route. Japp raised an eyebrow. Then where the devil is he? Poirot's lips curled into a satisfied smile. He is exactly where no one would dare to look, where only the most audacious criminal would dare to hide. A chill ran through me. Japp leaned forward, his impatience mounting. And where's that? Poirot tapped the side of his nose. Why, my dear Japp, he said softly, he never left at all. A stunned silence filled the room. My pulse quickened. Japp's face darkened. You mean? Poirot's smile widened. Exactly. Poirot leaned back, his eyes twinkling with mischief, his fingers pressed lightly together as he considered the question at hand. For a brief moment, an eerie silence hung in the air, then slowly an enigmatic smile crept across his face, like a magician preparing to unveil the final act of his performance. My friends, he said, his voice measured and deliberate, if I were a man on the run, hunted by the police, do you know where I should choose to hide? Japp and I exchanged puzzled glances. Poirot's expression was one of pure satisfaction as he let the question linger, stretching the suspense to its very limits. Then with an almost theatrical flourish, he leaned forward and whispered, in a prison. Japp's mouth fell open. I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. In a prison. Japp echoed, disbelieving. You're joking, Poirot. Poirot merely shrugged, his face radiating amusement. Joking, not in the least. His voice dropped to a murmur, though every word was crisp and clear. You, mon cher ami, have been looking for Monsieur Davenheim in order to put him in prison. But did it not occur to you that he might already be there? Japp shot up from his chair, his newspaper crumpling in his grip. What the devil are you saying? I am saying, Poirot continued smoothly, that if you were to escort Madame Davenheim to Bow Street and present her with a certain man known as Billy Kellett, she would recognize him instantly. Japp's brow furrowed. Billy Kellett, but that's absurd. He's just some petty crook. He's been in and out of jail for years. What would that gutter snipe have to do with Davenheim? Poirot's smile widened. Ah, mon ami, but Davenheim was not in Buenos Aires last autumn as you believe. No, he was here, in London, crafting the identity of Billy Kellett. He spent months embedding himself in the underworld, committing minor offenses, ensuring he was arrested and seen doing time. A perfect alibi, n'est-ce pas? The police never suspect one of their own prisoners. A man already behind bars is the last person they would chase. A stunned silence fell over the room. Japp swore under his breath. You mean to say he did time deliberately? But of course. Poirot tapped his temple. He was playing for very high stakes, my friend. The man was embezzling a fortune, setting up a grand escape, and when the moment was right, he vanished, not into the shadows, not into a foreign land, but into a prison cell, where no one would look for him. I felt my mind racing to catch up with the brilliance of the scheme. But Poirot, I stammered, if Davenheim became Billy Kellett, then how did he manage to switch back? Wouldn't that have been impossible? Not impossible, merely inconvenient, Poirot said with a knowing smirk. You see, once he had committed his final crime, and faked his own disappearance, he had to return to his true form. The beard, the wig, it all had to go. But here, mon ami, is where he made his only mistake. Japp's gaze sharpened. Go on. Poirot's expression turned sly. He had spent so long as Billy Kellett, transforming himself into a common criminal, that he overlooked one vital detail. When he resumed his disguise as himself, Monsieur Davenheim, he had to wear a false beard, false eyebrows, false everything. But mon Dieu, have you ever tried to sleep with a false beard? Japp looked utterly bewildered. I can't say I have, no. Poirot chuckled. It is not comfortable, and more importantly, it is not secure. Imagine, my dear Japp, a wife accustomed to her husband's face, no matter how inattentive, how disinterested she may be. Do you not think she would notice something off? The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. That's why he stopped sharing a room with her, I exclaimed. He was afraid she'd discover the disguise. Poirot clapped his hands together. Précisément, and that, mon ami, was his undoing. Japp's face darkened. By God, Poirot, if you're right about this. Poirot gave a slight bow, his eyes gleaming. Oh my dear Japp, I am always right. Poirot leaned back, a satisfied gleam in his eyes, as he recounted the final piece of the puzzle. His voice, calm and unhurried, cut through the charged atmosphere like a knife. You, mon cher Japp, discovered for me that ever since his supposed return from Buenos Aires, Monsieur Davenheim and his wife had been living separately. A small detail, yet a most telling one. He paused, tapping a fingertip to his temple. That was the moment I knew. Everything fell into place. Parfaitement. Japp remained frozen, his fingers gripping the back of a chair. But the gardener saw Davenheim walking toward the lake. Exactly, Poirot agreed, his voice silky, and he was quite right. Monsieur Davenheim did go to the lake, but not to disappear, at least not in the way everyone assumed. No, my friend, he went to the boathouse. There, waiting for him, were the carefully hidden garments of Billy Kellett, the ragged clothes of a vagrant, clothes that had been stowed away long in advance, hidden from the prying eyes of his valet. A final transformation. The weight of Poirot's words settled heavily in the room. Japp's expression darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Poirot continued, almost as if savoring the intricate beauty of the deception. He changed quickly, discarded his expensive suit, and did what any man would do when wishing to erase his past. He destroyed the evidence. His fine clothing, soaked with the scent of wealth and luxury, was unceremoniously dumped into the lake. The water swallowed them whole, leaving only the tramp behind. Hastings, who had been silent until now, spoke up in a near whisper. And then, Poirot's smile deepened, and then, mon ami, he carried out the final act of his grand illusion. He pawned his own ring, an act of misdirection so bold, it was almost insolent. What man, truly running from justice, would make such a careless mistake? Japp sucked in a sharp breath. He wanted to get caught. Précisément. Poirot's eyes flashed with triumph. He needed to be arrested, needed to secure his hiding place before the hue and cry began. And what better way to do so than by attacking a policeman? A guaranteed ticket, straight to Bow Street, where he would be safely locked away, hidden in plain sight. A man already behind bars, who would ever suspect him? A long silence followed, thick with disbelief. It's impossible, Japp murmured, shaking his head as if to rid himself of the sheer audacity of it all. Poirot merely smiled, his confidence unwavering. Ask Madame Davenheim, he said simply. The next morning, as we sat at breakfast, a registered letter arrived. Poirot slit it open with a flick of his knife, and from within, a crisp £5 note fluttered onto the table. Japp's grudging acknowledgement of defeat. Poirot frowned at the note, as if it personally offended him. Ah sacré, what am I to do with this? He tapped his chin thoughtfully. I feel almost guilty. See, pauvre Japp, it was all too simple, too easy. I who would not steal from a child, mille tonnerres. And then suddenly, his face brightened. An idea. We shall have a dinner, we three. That will console me. A small celebration for a victory, but a victory nonetheless." Hastings burst into laughter, the tension in the air melting away. Poirot merely sat back, his eyes twinkling, as if the whole affair had been nothing more than a pleasant game of chess, one he had, as always, won effortlessly.